So I was saying, I think we need to distinguish between political protests and what we observed in Brazil in January this year, right? Which I don't think meet that definition. And you know, what we had in Brazil were really attacks against these buildings of the Brazilian government branches, right? Both against the buildings, but also against the institutions that they represent. And these attacks were staged with an intent to topple a government that had been legitimately elected, which was President Lula's government, which the you know, participants in these events did not recognize you know, his election and the legitimacy of those results, based on things that we're going to talk about here, but mostly fake news and misinformation regarding the integrity and safety of the voting machines. So okay. So both in terms of their methods and their intent, what really these people wanted was to stage a coup d'etat. And I say a coup d'etat as opposed to an insurrection. We have a political scientist here because in these events, we also had participation of people who were part of the Brazilian state. And I'm going to talk more about this. And that's where kind of the difference is, right? You have an insurrection if you're talking about outsiders from state power. You have a coup if you have people who are, you know, at least some of whom are integrated to the power structure, but they are marginal in that power structure. And like I was saying, it's a group of, you know, a sizable group of people who don't recognize the results of the election, and they embrace this big lie, the idea that the elections had been defrauded, right? And had plans to subvert the results. Not only the attacks were part of this, but also things that are coming up, which involve the attempt to wiretap a Supreme Court justice who has a role in overseeing the elections, you know, to potentially demonstrate that he was involved in this fraud and justify those more extreme measures. I'm going to say or make just a couple of points here, which I think might be interesting for this comparative conversation that we're trying to have between Brazil and Peru, but also to a comparison with the United States itself. So first point that I wanted to make is that this is not an overnight development. This is not something that happened, you know, from January 7 to January 8. It's something that has been building up in the Brazilian social and political fabric for quite a few years, since the 2010s. I mean, students who take my Modern Brazil classes, they know that these last couple of years in Brazilian politics have been very eventful. We had Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in 2016, which many people, including myself, don't see as, you know, it's an impeachment by the books, but I think it was a little bit of a hardball game that the opposition to Rousseff decided to play. We have Lula's arrest in 2018 and his removal from a presidential race that he was leading, which enables Bolsonaro's election as the president of the country. And his role between 2019 and 2022, when, you know, he did a number of things that actually contribute to these events that we witnessed. And we can even go back and add other, you know, components to this. And this is what the interview that I gave that Charlie made a reference to a couple of weeks ago, when I was highlighting, for example, the role of this anti-corruption investigation that happened in Brazil, which actually led to Lula's arrest in radicalizing some of the Brazilian population. I have this paper where I demonstrate that one of the methods of the anti-corruption crusaders here was exactly to foster hostility toward the Supreme Court among the population, because they wanted the Supreme Court to rule in a certain direction. So, you start telling people that the Supreme Court is complicit with this corruption scheme, that they are going to protect and cause systematic impunity, right? And people start to develop that anger toward the Supreme Court. And this is something that I demonstrate analyzing the social media accounts from the lead prosecutor in this case, where we already start to see in 2017, 2018, 2019, people claiming that the Supreme Court should be overthrown, all the justices should be removed, and so on, which is something that then Bolsonaro builds upon, especially, right? The Supreme Court becomes one of his main targets, or the judiciary in the system, and in part because the judiciary plays a role in overseeing the elections. And this is something that there's a difference between the United States, for example, and Brazil. We know that in the United States, it is electoral commissions, right, that oversee elections. So they are part of the executive somehow. But in Brazil, it's the judiciary that actually oversees the elections. And so Bolsonaro, starting in 2019, he started, alleging that the Brazilian ballot machines were not safe or secure, that, we should change the system. There are indicia that this benefited the Workers' Party in the past, which are all baseless claims. But, that kind of brought people's attention to the role of these judges. And as Brazil decided to keep with its system, which it had no reason to change, the court became a target of Bolsonaro. So that's the first point, right? We have to go back a little bit in contemporary Brazilian history to be able to understand, and we have all these elements. The second point that I wanted to make, which somehow relates to this, is that in the case of Brazil, we have a role that the police and the military play in this attempted coup d'etat, which is why I call it an attempted coup d'etat, right? I don't think we got to see in that film that I was showing, all the details, but there are scenes there, and there were scenes in this invasion of the government branch buildings in which we see the police, for example, collaborating with the invaders, facilitating their access, right? Even taking selfies with the invaders. And, there's now an investigative commission there's an investigation into this, which has shown the role of some of the military in, for example, prohibiting the police, which at some point decided to arrest some of these invaders, from arresting them. And this all relates to, for example, the politicization of the police and the military that happened through the Bolsonaro years, right? But I think it also dates back, a few decades ago, maybe all the way to the military coup in 1964, when the Brazilian police and the military got into the idea that we had domestic enemies, the communists, right? And even though the country re-democratized in the 80s, that kind of mentality persisted in these institutions. And few people were actually paying attention to this. They all thought that the military now had agreed to play by the rules of the democratic game. But now we are finding out that they did not necessarily, that they, kept cultivating this idea that there was a communist threat, right, that was represented now by not only the Workers' Party, but all the progressive movements in the country that they had to protect the country against. And even interpreting some pieces of legislation as enablers of this role, which again, it's not true. And I wanted to end this. How do we define this? It's something different than political protests. It gets close to a coup d'etat. It has roots in some things that are more specific to Brazil, like these events that preceded the invasions, the role of the military and the history of the military and the police. But also, I think it has a lot of similarities with what's happening or what's happened recently in the U.S. too, maybe more so than in Peru. And just like in the U.S., we had an invasion of the capital, right, based on the big lie that elections had been defrauded. We had the same thing in Brazil, right? Some of the operatives behind this misinformation machine that Bolsonaro operates that enabled so many people to believe this. We have something similar in the United States. And actually, like I was saying, some of the operatives are the same. We know that Steve Bannon, for example, plays a role in supporting and providing advice and ideas to the Brazilian golpistas here, right? And so this has been in the press. So I came across this article in the Washington Post right after the event where they highlight some of these links between Brazil and the U.S. in terms of far-right radicalization and those anti-democratic events. But it's also coming up tomorrow in Lula's and Biden's meeting, because one of the topics in which they are expected to collaborate is precisely the defense of democracy. And so, I'm pretty sure that they will talk about ways in which that kind of far-right extremism can be better dealt with and reduced in each of the countries, but also across the countries, given these linkages that I was making a reference to. That's what I wanted to say, just by way of, situating a little bit what's going on and providing some elements for us to discuss. Thank you.
Please sit down. We have time for one or two questions. Fabio. Okay. Any quick questions before you have to leave?
We have Michele here who can speak about Brazil too later, but if there's anything that I said that you want to. You have any? Okay, thank you. Bolsonaro, yeah. Yeah, so Bolsonaro is actually in the United States right now. He's in Florida. He's been here since he lost the elections. And his visa has expired because he came on a presidential visa. So he's applying to a tourist visa. So maybe that's something that President Biden and President Lula will talk about.
I did think of a question. What's the most important distinction between what happened in the U.S. and what happened in, you point out some similarities. Yeah. What would be the most salient? You're going to talk about that? Okay. All right.
I'm going to still talk.
Very good. Very good. So our next speaker, we're going to now move to Peru as a case. And Victor Maqque is a native Quechua scholar from Macusani, Puno. His hometown is a place that has seen violence and seen death in these protests. And the region of Puno has been the most deadly to date in the struggle. So it's been very intense in terms of the protests and such. He has a background in sociology and a doctorate in history with a focus on Latin America and Andean studies. He currently directs the Latin American Sustainability Initiative here at OU while serving as a clinical professor of practice in the Department of History. So please welcome Dr. Victor Maqque. No.
Yes, it's Charlie. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. And thank you, Charlie, for inviting us to this discussion. I think the part of the darkest history of these two countries in Latin America. And for history of Latin America tends to be always kind of, bittersweet. Yeah, and for those of us who focus more in the indigenous and popular sectors history, even more. It's never a celebratory history. It's never a great triumph in the Andes in Latin America. So I hope we'll be able to show a little bit more of glimmers of hope and what's going on. And I think Fabio and Michelle will talk more about how Brazil it is actually seeing what is possible to do. Peru seems to me a little bit more difficult at the moment. So it has been established. I would like to follow these three points quickly. A persistent history of Native communities struggles in the Andes. Second point, colonial legacies. And then a brief back to the moment transition from indigenismo to terrorismo, or terrorist labeling in the region. It's been established that the current political crisis in Peru is mainly between the native communities in the highlands and the right-wing governing elites in the country. As New York Times put it, the clearest repudiation of the establishment. So the enduring history of, I don't see this is moving. What about that? Thank you, Fabio. So indigenous communities in the Andes have been struggling for mobilizing, resisting, since we have records of them. And the mechanics of their mobilization resistance have changed. What have changed very little, I think, it's the way they are perceived and considered subordinate members of their societies. Native community members in the Andes, called Indios del Común, have resisted what they saw as oppressive dispossessions of lands, possessions, and their rights to have a place in the world. Throughout the 300 years of colonial history in Latin America, they quickly learned from the beginning of the colonial period, they quickly learned how to use the legal system to resist the system. Their caciques became expert litigants to use the legal system and reduce the amount of demands of the colonial regime. And towards the end of the colonial period, since mid 1700s, these local struggles evolved into fully fledged armed confrontations with the colonial power. This era is known as the age of the Andean insurrections. Native leaders such as Juan Santos Atahualpa, Tupac Amaru, Tupac Katari, Tomás Katari, in the 1780s, shook the whole colonial structure. And their basic demands of these movements were elimination of the deeply hated corregidores, the Spanish magistrates who ruled over the indigenous territories. And also the creation of a royal court closer in the region. And finally, the elimination of tribute, Indian taxation, and mita, the forced labor of indigenous communities for the colonial government. They also, in the process, accused their own caciques for being alienated and not defending as they should their communities. This process facilitated, engagement of the community at community level in politics. Men and women of the communities mobilized, used litigation backed by massive collective mobilization before the courts, and they, literally dragged their colonial officials to the royal courts to sue them for different abuses of power. These mobilizations in the 1700s, 1780s and on happened in this region of it's a modern map, and the red area there is where that happened. This shook the entire continent and facilitated the process of independence. The colonial legacies for the communities, however, the independence only removed the Spanish elites from the pyramid. The Criollo elites, the elite sectors and the coastal areas, stepped in right in on top of the pyramid and made every effort to maintain the indigenous communities and popular sectors at the bottom, second-class residents. David Cahill, a historian of the Andes, it says the first century after independence, the indigenous communities in the Andes experienced the most devastating attack of their possessions since the conquest. The majority of the productive lands were encroached by aristocratic-style landed elites in the region. The Indian tribute, loudly eliminated during the independence ceremonies, was immediately reimposed with a different name as indigenous contribution, because they realized that in order to make the government structure, they needed funds, and there was no other thing than to sustain that than the indigenous community. Now, from indigenismo to terrorismo. In the southern highlands of Peru, the increasing conflicts between indigenous communities and the landed elites characterized the first half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Jorge Basadre, the Peruvian foremost classic historian, called this era of the Peruvian history as the Republic of the Aristocracy, the República Aristocrática. And these intellectuals from Lima discussed for years in the early 1900s the indigenismo, the Indian problem. What do we do with Indians in the highlands? They led the Peruvian nation building, but never integrated indigenous communities into citizenry. Nevertheless, the long demands for agrarian reforms finally comes around in the 1960s and 70s. Juan Velasco, a military general, stormed into power with the so-called revolutionary government, promising that the peasants will no longer be foreigners of their own lands, their poverty would no longer enrich their masters or the land elites. Yet, this mainly resulted in a reform for the books. Before the eyes of the communities, lands passed from these landed elites to the new agrarian associations, or asociaciones agrarias, managed by government-appointed local administrators, and only marginal portion went to the actual communities. In the case of Puno, according to José Luis Renick, a social historian of the Andes, from near 2 million hectares seized from haciendas, almost 90% of it were turned into empresas asociativas, and only 40,000 hectares were actually returned to the indigenous communities. So native indigenous communities continue to struggle for lands and better conditions of life. Some communities even decide to take their own land reforms. They went to seize lands from these very new agrarian associations. It's in that context that in the 1980s, a devastating internal armed conflict started in Ayacucho, and also Andean region in the south of Peru. By leader of a then obscure Peruvian Communist Party that it was renamed by him as the Shining Path. In responding to the Shining Path, the autocratic government of the 1990s in Peru utilized extreme military tactics to combat the called Shining Path terrorists, and also eliminate anything that will resemble a criticism or opposition to the government. The result, as reported by the Truth Commission in Peru, was near to 70,000 people killed in those 20 years of violence. And 3 out of every 4 of those were native Quechua-speaking people. Campesinos, a significant part of them, were also from the region of Puno. So after this long detour, I come to the current crisis. These communities, so in the last 500 years, endured literally everything, resisting for their lands and their place in the world. From governing elites, they have been largely ignored, considered uneducated rural masses, unfit for modern urban society norms that rule the country. Most urban elite sectors in Peru perceive campesinos in the highlands, like Puno, as anti-industry, anti-development, and portrayed on massive protests against mining, oil, development in the Amazon, and the like. These campesinos, who when they speak Spanish is difficult to understand, as Mario Vargas Llosa, the Nobel laureate, puts it, tend to be perceived incapable to act on their own. They are also always manipulated and funded by foreign interests, NGOs, the socialist leaders like Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, Evo Morales or Evo Morales, as some of the elites in Lima call them, illegal mining interests, or the Shining Path. Therefore, they are communists, radical communists, and terrorists. These South Andean communities have been, however, increasingly influential in the recent national elections in the country, mainly opposing the right-wing Lima-centered elite sectors and their candidates. In 1990, they have opposed the right-wing candidate, Mario Vargas Llosa himself, running for president. In 2001, they decidedly supported a radical anti-establishment campaign of the candidate that ran on Alejandro Toledo, who was elected in 2001. This map massively, supported a outsider who was coming back in the country, and not a traditional politician in the country. In 2011, they decidedly supported a radical anti-establishment campaign of a self-identified leftist nationalist candidate in opposition to the right-wing elite sector's candidate. You see the map, all that in red is this is the district level results in the elections in 2011. In 2021, again, in opposition to the same right-wing Lima elite candidate, the majority of the South and the Highland communities massively supported a rural primary school teacher who was mostly ignored in the main media, focused on the capital city and other big urban centers. Again, all the dark red sectors is this at the district level results of the election in 2021. These are the same native communities and popular sectors from the Southern Andes and towns across the Andes who have been flooding the streets in their towns, cities, and Lima, demanding to be listened. For the current president to resign, for the Congress to be closed, for new elections, fresh elections to be called, and a new constitution to be drawn. The results that they had so far in more than 2 months of protests in the streets and the roads are more than 60 people killed. in brutal police and military repression. And also a massive campaign of labeling as terrorists, and local media blatantly deciding not to investigate the killings and the involvement of authorities in the country. It appears as if the country is back in the 1990s, when the economic powers allied with the president, then president, controlled the military, the press, the judiciary, and eliminated all the opposition. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. That was very moving and very effective, I think, in many ways. For some reason, I see there's a photograph actually on this next panel, but it's not showing up. There it is. So I would like to talk using what Victor said as a base, if you will, for the historical background, right? A little more about what's been going on most recently, but of course, which is in fact rooted in all of the things that he was arguing. The left-hand picture here is a picture of one of the 17, it's the coffins of 17 protesters who were killed in a single day in a single set of events in Puno on the 9th of January this year. The right-hand side is an image of the road between Puno and Arequipa, blocked by boulders, and the boulders don't do the blocking on their own. The blockade is maintained by people who are there, and that is a bit of the current situation. So just a little bit from perhaps also a little more of a political point of view, what has happened and why it has happened. In terms of the what, the triggering event, which isn't the only reason. Every time you ask what, you get a triggering event, and you say, well, why did that happen? Why did that happen? So I don't mean to suggest that this is the only thing of importance, but it is quite obviously the most important triggering event. And that is that Pedro Castillo, who had served for 16 months as the democratically elected president, went on TV and announced that he was carrying out a coup in Peru. He said that he was going to establish an emergency government that would rule by decree, no longer through laws issued by Congress. He would dissolve Congress. He would convene elections for a Congress that would write a new constitution. And of course, a new group of people would be elected, perhaps more amenable to his interests. He would rule by decree until that happened. He imposed a nationwide martial law with a curfew from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. He announced that he was taking control of the public prosecutor's office, which is much more autonomous in Peru than the Department of Justice is in the United States. It's a almost fully autonomous unit, but he was going to take control of that. He was going to take control of the judiciary, which had been investigating him for corruption. He was going to take control of the Constitutional Court. He announced that everyone possessing a weapon illegally must turn it into police within 72 hours, which was a little strange because very few people in Peru actually have weapons. It's not a society like the US where lots and lots of people have weapons. They're actually quite rare. So I don't really know why he did this. And at the end, he said, we're going to respect the current economic model and laws, respect private property. In other words, business people, you have nothing to fear. So that's what he announced. Now, in saying this, he said, why? He said, I'm going to restore democracy and the rule of law to Peru. And that these actions are justified due to the evil obstructionism of the majority in Congress, who didn't agree with him and didn't want to pass his laws. And who he said were identified with racist interests and social interests in general, which was a little confusing about what that meant, but the racist part was quite clear. This majority, he went on to say, was identified with the great monopolistic and I can't even pronounce that, interests, sought nothing other than his removal from office because it was impossible for them to conceive of a campesino, a peasant, president governing the country. So that was the triggering moment. What happened immediately after that was that the coup failed, which was not a foregone conclusion. Coups often succeed, but this failed. And it failed in part because none of the members of his cabinet the people who most loyally were trying to carry out his mission in politics and society. None of his advisors, his personal lawyer, his supporters in Congress, other members of leftist parties in Congress that were not members of his party, the leader of the party with which he had run for the government, run for the presidency, but had since distanced himself. And of perhaps less surprising, the police, the military, the media, no one supported his actions, at least no one of those who I've just listed. Right? So one of the interesting things that happened that day was that across party and ideological lines, all of these political actors agreed that what Castillo had done was unacceptable, and he could not remain in office. When he did this, it carefully mimicked something that Victor made allusion to, and that was a previous president who carried out a coup exactly like this, but successfully, and then ruled for another 8 years before he had to flee the country. That was Fujimori, for those of you who are aware of that. He used some of the language, he set himself up, made a very similar kind of announcement, and gave some of the same, used some of the same language as Fujimori in justifying this. And most Peruvians who were involved in politics, at least, had thought we don't want to go back to those days where a president, for whatever justification, decides to rule on his own. So Congress met and voted 101-6 to remove him from office. 10 people abstained, and he was arrested shortly afterwards and remains detained. His vice president, Dina Boluarte, was then sworn in as Peru's first female president in line of succession. She, like Castillo, is from one of Peru's poorest regions. She's from Apurímac, he's from Cajamarca. And she had run with the same party. They were part of the same party when they ran for office, but she had not gone along in this direction with him. So if you read this just to this point, right, you'd say, okay, so why so much protest? Well, the protests began soon afterwards. They haven't stopped. Who protested, right? Well, one of the early surveys, just days after this happened, said, do you agree or disagree with Boluarte becoming president? 71% of Peruvians said we disagree with her becoming president. Only 27% were in agreement. Now, they did so for different reasons. Many people on the left saw her as a traitor, moving over to the establishment, or the people on the right. Many people on the right saw her as just the same as Castillo and didn't think that she had the capability, didn't trust her, thought that she was a leftist. It's not that they thought she was leftist. She was very much a leftist. They both ran on the platform of a Marxist-Leninist party. But wide repudiation, right? And if you break this down by class, you see that there's differences, right? There's less repudiation of her among the upper and upper middle class people. But even there, a majority disagreed with her becoming president. And as you move down to the middle and to the poor and very poor, right, it becomes even more massive. This is also true when you look across the various regions of the country, metropolitan Lima, then the urban centers nationwide, and then the rural sectors nationwide. And you can see there that, yes, there's a difference, but again, it's massive, a disagreement with her becoming president. And similarly, if you look at the various regions of the country. So very few people wanted her in office. And a lot of people had a lot of different reasons to undermine and to try to seek her expulsion. While this, from this same polling date, which is just again a few days after the coup attempt, 44% of those polled agreed with Castillo in taking out his action, right, with carrying out that coup. They thought that that was a good thing. 53% said they didn't. Similarly, with slightly lower numbers, right? 38% said that they thought a military coup would be justified in Peru when things are going bad, which they clearly are right now. So support for democracy and its institutions seems to be quite weak, right? And from various points of view, then both left, right, center, different people have different reasons, but a lot of people are supporting non-democratic alternatives. The violence then has unfolded, but first as a form of protest, right? So protests are often largely peaceful. A lot of people are just in the street making their voices heard. Most often there is a violent component in the sense that some people, right, not the majority and not necessarily what the organizers are planning, right, engage in destruction of property, looting, burning buildings. And a lot of the people in the protests, and this is just as far as I've been going to Peru for many decades now, every time I've been near a protest or even been part of a protest, there is a dynamic of the police restricting movement and protesters wanting to go wherever they're restricted from. And that's resulting in pushing and shoving and often then throwing and things like that. The police are better protected with shields and things like that. But they're often outnumbered. And they then use tear gas and such. And what we've seen in this protest, like many protests in Peru, is that tear gas becomes a lethal weapon when the tear gas canisters are not aimed high in the sky or down at the feet, but directly at people, right? So a number of the people being killed are being killed by tear gas projectiles. However, there were two times that massive numbers of people were killed in one place at one time. So you see lots of, 2 people killed, 4 people killed, et cetera. Those are civilians being killed in protests. Then you see these 2 events in Ayacucho and Puno, where very large numbers of people were killed. These people were killed with bullets and with shotgun pellets and things like that, not tear gas canisters and stuff like that. So there's different levels of violence at different moments by different actors. It's not all the same. It happens that these 2 cases were cases where the protesters were attempting to take over the local airport and to shut it down. And so troops there, the police were tasked with the task of keeping it open. And when they responded to this, they went way beyond keeping it open, right? They pursued people. They pursued people away from the airport. They weren't content to stay within the airport, if you will, and just defend. They went after people and shot people, large numbers of people. And a number of the people who were shot were not even part of the protest. Some young people, if you were in the wrong place, obviously you could get hit by a bullet, right? And so those were the 2 most, if you will, shocking episodes. But throughout the entire period of time, as you can see, with the exception of the Christmas truce, if you will, there have been people protesting and people being killed throughout the country. There has been about 11 people who've been killed or who died as a result of the blockades, people who couldn't get to medical services, people who needed to get to a hospital and the people would not let them through, right? The blockade was the blockade, and so you just can't go. Or some people trying to get around it suffered fatal automobile accidents. So some people died due to the blockades. Out of that 60 or so total, 1 police person was killed by a mob and burned in his police car. Again, we have numbers of wounded. This, of course, aren't all the wounded. These are the ones that the Ministry of Health have actually treated. And you see 900 civilians, but almost 300 police have been treated by that. Now, the police say that there's 500 wounded police, right? So they have their own figures, but the Ministry of Health tells us it's about 300. So there is a lot of protest and a significant amount of violence going on. But again, most of the protest's intent is not violent. But along with the nonviolent protests, these other events happen, right? And so the people responding to that often focus only on the burning, the arson, the attacks on the police and such, as if that were the only kind of protest going on. Today, this is yesterday, actually the chart of roads that are blocked. The left-hand side shows you where this is in Peru, and the right-hand side shows you a little bit more detail. The very uppermost of these, to the upper left of that line, are actually weather-related. They were mudslides, but all the others are human protest blockades. So right now, the blockading action is highly concentrated in the south, where, as Victor has mentioned, right, there is a long history and there is a demographic aspect to what's going on there in terms of indigenous peoples and their struggles. I should also say, these areas that you see where blockades are going on were places that voted at an extremely high rate for Castillo. We're talking 80, 90% of the votes in many of these districts were cast for Castillo. So not only is there this historical deep reasons why they might be protesting, but there's a more particular thing is that he was their guy, right? And he was taken out, right? And so they personally believe that that was wrong in a way that people who didn't vote for Castillo, right, might not necessarily identify with. So some ideas about why, and these will just be cursory. We can talk about these more. There is what we've been talking about, Victor's presentation, the historical poverty, neglect, and oppression, all being part of this severe deprivation, inequality, and racism that is prevalent in many parts of Peru, most of Peru. There are some other things that are a little bit more about the conjuncture of time right now, right? One is that Peru experienced a significant economic boom for over a decade, in which it had very high rates of economic growth, about 6% or so, during which time poverty fell significantly. Many people moved into the middle class, and inequality fell as well. But the boom ended. And when the boom ended, all of those things also began to reverse. People who had gotten out of poverty fell back into poverty, inequality grew worse, and the sense of deprivation intensified even more than it had been before this, because part of deprivation is what you're comparing yourself to. And if you're comparing yourself to what you just were, or to others who are experiencing boom, right, the sensation of deprivation becomes even more intense. To that then was added COVID. Peru, for reasons that we're still not fully understanding, experienced the highest per capita excess death rate in the entire world, as documented presently by all the people who document such things, right? There may be countries that were worse that didn't document their deaths, right? But why Peru, right? We don't know. We're working on that, right? But it happened, right? So it was absolutely devastating. And it experienced, perhaps not so surprisingly, the worst economic collapse in Latin America as a result of this. So not only were people experiencing a downward trend, but then this hit and just shoved them way, way over the edge, right? Then we have the electoral cycle of 21, right? And we have Castillo becoming president with all of this symbolism and meaning that it meant for someone of his origin. He wasn't the first person with very poor Andean origins to become president. Toledo, who was mentioned before, was such a person. But Toledo had, in the meantime, become a Stanford doctorate and worked for the World Bank. And so he had changed his identity, if you will, while retaining parts of it, right? But Castillo came right from the countryside, where he was a rural school teacher, right? So he was, in that sense, clearly the first campesino president. And this polarized society in many ways, as did his opponent. His opponent was a very polarizing figure, and Peru in general has become very polarized as a result of this. So that whole dynamic and the resentment and I don't know, just the upsetness, if you will, with having their president removed, right, is a very powerful thing. Finally, I would just add that Peru has been a very highly centralized country, and everything is Lima-centric, and most things still are. It did, however, 20 years ago, begin a decentralization process, which has been quite significant, but a lot of that hasn't worked very well. People were given political authority, but they weren't given the means to carry that out effectively. And one of the things that people often talk about is that about 30 to 50% of municipal and regional budgets don't get spent every year because they don't have the means to carry out the projects. So you've got all these projects that have been authorized, the budget's been given, and they don't happen. And lots of projects that start and then stop halfway through. And a road halfway built is not very useful. The bridge halfway built doesn't work, right? So there's lots and lots of frustration, not just at the national level, right? But even with local and regional level governments that are doing no doubt their best, but not very well, not very well. 2014, Stephen Levitsky wrote that the post-Fujimori regime has now survived for 13 years, and this is noteworthy, longer than any other democracy in Peruvian history. No Peruvian democracy, and actually no authoritarian regime in the 20th century lasted longer than 12 years. So he pointed out that Peruvians remain deeply dissatisfied, even during the boom times. When the boom ends, there's going to be a lot going on. So we will stop there just because of time. Let me just add these other points without going into them. The problem of corruption, both former presidents and Castillo himself was central to this story. It can't be understood without that. And finally, a constitutional political crisis that's been unfolding since 2016 with the removal of several presidents and presidents also dissolving Congress. He wasn't the first to try to do that. A weak party and a weak state. Thank you. Sorry, I'm supposed to introduce before you speak, just real briefly. Michelle Morais is also professor of Department of International Area Studies. I mentioned the co-director of the Center for Brazil Studies. Before coming to OU, she was the head of the graduate programs and professor at Brazil's National School of Public Administration. Her research agenda has been mostly focused on issues of international cooperation for development, public policy, and human rights. Thank you. Brazil, Peru, no?
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, everyone. Whoever speaks last always has less time, so I'll try my best to really keep it to 10 minutes so that we can have some kind of conversation about all of this that you have heard. I thought, this picture was not only very representative of what happened in Brazil on January 8th, but it was also sort of a bigger representation of some of these larger issues and larger processes that we have seen in the region. So I wanted to sort of try to analyze some of the comparative aspects here between Brazil and Peru. Of course, my analysis will be very skewed because I know about Brazil so much more than I know about Peru. So forgive me for that. But it seems that, not only in comparing these two countries, but also we could include a number of other countries in this process, there is, this perception of, just shattered democracies, right? I know it was sort of a lot of information and detail for all of you, right, to hear today in thinking of Brazil and thinking about Peru. And I thought, what are some of the points that, we could, really take home in drawing those connections? So in thinking of some of the convergences, right, and I think actually, if I had heard to Victor before preparing my presentation, I think there is absolutely a point to be made about the colonial legacies, right? And how those colonial legacies have driven inequality and very unequal societies, right? And you can't understand these two countries without thinking of the colonial legacies, the social and economic inequalities that both countries go through, not to mention the racial disparities and discrimination, right? So I think that's absolutely sort of a starting point in drawing those comparisons. But also, I think we cannot, we have to start by also recognizing the shared authoritarian pasts. I know many of you here are, history majors, Latin American majors, and students of many of my colleagues here. And I know all of you have studied a bit about both countries' authoritarian pasts. That is an absolutely core issue in analyzing the current events in these countries, because we have a term in Portuguese that I think it's very important and that we could use here, which is what we call the authoritarian rubbish, right? We say in Portuguese, entulho autoritário, which means that authoritarian past is not only something to be recognized as part of history, but it really trickles down to a lot of the microdynamics that we see in our societies, right? Either in the form of police violence, in the form of discrimination of specific social movements. And this was something that became absolutely clear in the January 8th attacks. As Fabio was saying, the police did not resist the invasion of the government buildings, and the invaders had specific racial features predominantly, right, and came from specific socioeconomic classes, although the class divide currently in Brazil is not as great as in Peru, but there is some, right? In terms of, political alignments. And so that authoritarian past really cuts through how state institutions react, for instance, to protests, right? In Brazil, every time you have a teacher protest and you have a teacher strike and teachers are walking out, they're going to be received with a lot more violence in comparison, for instance, to what we saw on January 8th, right? So Charlie mentioned, the Truth Commission in Peru. Brazil also had its own Truth Commission just recently. And the transition process to democracy, I believe in both countries, has not been complete, right? Has not been, in terms of truth, memory, and reconciliation, we haven't really settled our past. And this still runs through a number of the dynamics, I think, in both societies. As Fabio said, democratic backsliding does not happen just overnight. I think it's really important in the case of Brazil to think of 2016 and the ousting of President Rousseff. In a number of ways, I see the situation in Peru today, and I think, well, this is Brazil in 2016, except for the resistance to the impeachment process that happened in 2016. And I want to get into that because I think that also explains some of the differences that we see in terms of the two countries nowadays. But I think recognizing that sort of simmering process and how much of political instability we've seen in Peru recently, right, with 7 presidents in 6 years, right? You can't understand the political turmoil of current days without recognizing that history of political instability, without recognizing a constitution that also comes, in great respect from that predominantly authoritarian past, and that how that constitution also creates instability to this day. Beyond the facts and the detail that you have heard today, it's really important that we take into account how long some of these processes have been going on and how they compound into what we see in terms of some of the turmoil of recent times. The military is center stage, and I think this is very important for a mostly American audience, right? The relation that we have in our countries with our military is very different, not only in terms of that authoritarian past, but also because in these crucial moments, democracy hangs in the balance because of the military. So it's very much dependent upon how the military is going to align itself with whatever is going on. So to some extent, Castillo possibly hoped that he would have support from the military. He didn't. And actually the military was on the side of, his successor, and also currently on the streets in the repression to the people who are on the streets, right? The same in the case of Brazil. Not only the military were supportive of what happened on January 8th, there were family members of the military who were camped outside of military headquarters since the election results in November. They were camped for 2 months asking for a military coup, right? So this is a really sort of out of the ordinary situation where people are out on the street asking for a military coup, right? And it refers back to that idea of a shattered democracy. So in this picture to the right, you see sort of that banner saying, please, armed forces, help us, right? And that sort of cry for a military coup. And in many moments, all of us had this feeling that, we're basically dependent on what the military will try to do. Where I think these two stories become a bit different has to do, I think, looking back to how the political left in Brazil responded to the impeachment of President Rousseff, right? So on the left-hand side, you see the day of the impeachment vote in Brazilian Congress, and you see to your left, the president's supporters, and you see to your right, those who were in favor of her impeachment, and how, you know, basically the Brazilian police organized both sides to make sure there was no violence. And with, you know, the results being that she was going to be ousted, actually the political left decided to accept the results, right? And we could have had violence and death at that moment, and we didn't. I think for a number of people, it was very frustrating not to see that reaction, right? Just to basically accept the way that the president was being impeached, but also her, I think, as a leader at that moment, was not inciting violence and was not inciting reaction. And I think that made a big difference, right? Especially if we fast forward to January 8th and the role of President Bolsonaro inciting that process. I think the same could be said for the role of President Lula, current president, but at the time in 2018, as some of you know, he was arrested and incarcerated during a time when he was actually running for president. You know, this is 2018, just before President Bolsonaro was elected. And in this picture, this is the day when he's arrested, right? And he goes to this massive place in São Paulo, gives a speech, is carried by the people, goes into a place. The police is supposed to come to arrest him. The people will not let the police get there. And he actually surrenders, and he finds a way to really go where the police is, allow them to come in safety, both protecting, you know, the thousands of people who were outside from violence, but also protecting the police from being, you know, attacked by, you know, the mobs. And he's able to surrender in a peaceful way, stays incarcerated for over a year, right? So I think the role of the leadership in not turning things violent in Brazil was also very important when we compare to Peru. And just finally, I just wanted to show you, you know, the first picture, you know, shows another part of the destruction that we had on, this is the presidential palace, and, you know, all the shattered glasses. The first picture that I had in the presentation, it really calls my attention that the door is already open. So it's not that people are breaking the glasses because they want to enter the building. Actually, just breaking the glasses because they want to break everything, right? It's just that institutional hate that they want to manifest. And regardless of all that destruction to Congress, to the presidential palace, and to the Supreme Court, you do not have a single death in those events in Brazil. First of all, because the police did not want to respond, the military did not want to respond. But even after a few hours, when there was a change of direction and there was a decision that there were going to be consequences, there are no arrests on the day of the events of January 8th. People start being arrested the next day. And so all these buses that you see here are carrying those who had been arrested. They arrested 1,500 people on a single day. They were transporting all of them to custody to be interviewed, to be seen by a judge. And this is, you know, sort of a space that they found where everyone was taken to. There are no complaints about torture, right? And currently investigations are going on, right? So, you know, I think Charlie asked Fabio, and I wanted to address that, you know, how I see the comparison between the two countries. I think there are a number of common elements of those common histories. But I think also in the case of Brazil, there has been a kind of institutional response of not resorting to as much violence and really trying to not make it personal about the president, but really about, you know, how institutions respond. And I think this has saved us a number of lives over the years. All right, thank you. I kept my promise.
So because Michelle was so much better than I was with time, we do have a few minutes for some questions. But let me just take 2 or 3, and then we'll ask those to whom they're directed to answer. So quick questions, please. Do say them briefly if you have one. Yes. Mhm. They run together. Quick answer. Other questions? Yes. Mhm. Mm.
Dissolve Congress. And then secondly, for Michelle, you talk about the class and racial character of the leaders.
Why don't you speak, please?
Yeah, so, the Black Brazil has not been as part of the unity of the past and certainly not carried into through. And that has to do with the radicalization that have happened over the especially since so in radicalized individuals that has groups that are not, different classes. And there is still a predominance of, a certain age group, especially in those individuals who attacked government buildings. There was very interesting prevalence of older age individuals, people about 50 years old. But there were also a number of people who were, the working classes that traveled, thousands of kilometers to get to the Villa, on buses that were paid for, and so there is an important discussion about how the business class in Brazil kind of against the government. But in terms of the people who participated, not as much. It's a lot more diverse, I think. But the truth is, in terms of who's going to be held accountable for those attacks, I think there will be a concentration of people who just went with the flow, right? They saw on a message group that it was going to be a caravan of buses for free to go to Brasilia, for them to protest in front of the military, and they just went. And they're now in prison where, family members of the military who were also were, given the possibility to leave and go home overnight from January 8th to 9th, where the others were just camping there in the Pacific, right? So I think that divide is not as part of the used to be.
You want to say something, or shall I? So with respect to Congress, it's quite diverse and very fragmented. The largest single party was the left-wing party on which he was elected, Castillo, and all the other parties are smaller. Among the right, there is an extremely reactionary right that sought to disallow 200,000 votes cast in the countryside as illicit votes in order to win the election, which is won by a fraction of 1%. So with 200,000 votes, you would change the outcome. And they campaigned and used illegal and legal means to try to pursue that end up until his inauguration. So those people would like to see him out of office regardless, before he had acted or done anything at all. And they have been after him this whole time. And so he's right about that. Where I think he probably is not quite right is that it's not necessarily all of Congress. There were attempted impeachments twice before, and he didn't get impeached. And on the day that he chose to do what he did, there was another one scheduled, and all of the analyses, everyone who checked the vote said he was going to come out again, free from that. So there some of the things he's talking about were going on in a very extreme way among some members of Congress, and Congress as a whole, was adversarial toward him. And they did not agree on policy, and they did not agree on a lot of things. And he had a huge number of allegations of corruption against him, and they were investigating all of those, as the judiciary was as well. So there was a lot of animosity, but the Congress itself is a bit diverse.
I'll just add that Castillo, even before he was declared as president, was already the right-wing sector of the Congress in Lima was already dismissing him and trying to block him not becoming president. It took, I believe, close to 2 months of investigations of the counting of votes until finally was declared president like 10 days before he was inaugurated.
Yeah, even less. But he didn't, the votes, because of all these protests of the votes and the effort to disallow them, he wasn't actually declared the official winner until just days before his inauguration. So that was the beginning of that relationship. Thank you very much for coming today. There's obviously a lot more all of us could have said, but we appreciate you listening to us for this amount of time. And we hope this has perked your interest in Latin America and in these events. Thank you very much.